Jay, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Absolutely. I want to start, by sort of unpacking where we are from a philosophical point of view, because, I grew up in the wake of Francis Fukuyama and others coming in saying, well, the end of history is upon us. The Cold War has come to an end, and that means that the triumph of liberal democracy and free markets is imminent, right? And this is pre-2000, basically, and they're basically heralding, the conquest of, in a sense, the New World Order. Now, fast forward, 2015, we have sort of disjointed New World Order that seems to be coming into effect, but we also have the birth of the BRIC nations in contrast to perhaps the collapsing Western economies centered around the Federal Reserve System, the central bank of the European Union, and the central bank in London, and then that's the IMF World Bank system ultimately. So basically two perhaps opposing ideologies. Then you have this new neo-caliphate being endorsed by the ISIS terrorist group, and perhaps less of the end of history and perhaps more of a beginning of a new history going forth into this century. So what do you see as the philosophical landscape that we're facing? Is it really, as Fukuyama said, the end of history insofar as liberalism has triumphed and democracy will prevail? Or is it more of actually just the end of history because we've forgotten our history and we're about to start all over again?
Good question. I think we have to go back to something like the French Revolution if we want to talk about what brought us to where we are today in the modern era. The French Revolution, in my view, was subject to the manipulation of different power blocks, particularly banking power blocks, international finance, that were able to basically stir up revolutionary movements, ideologies such as Jacobinism, which would actually later go on to be the Illuminati, as we speak of it historically. And so this ideology of radical communism takes root there, and it's all grounded in so-called democracy, so-called minority rights or whatever. But this is actually a tool. It's a tool of social engineering. It's a tool that rival power blocks can use, in another area to take down the existing power structure through social disintegration. So that, I think, is what sets the stage for the modern world to believe that we live in an era of so-called democracy. But in reality, we don't live in a democracy. We live in basically shadow oligarchs that run things from behind the scenes. So, as you mentioned, IMF, World Bank, Bank for National Settlements, these kinds of things are essentially the ultimate power structures behind the national governments and so forth that we see. So when you tie in the fact that for the last 400 or 500 years, Western empires, particularly the British Empire, was built up through the drug trade, through opium. That was its bread and butter. And so the so-called free markets that Adam Smith and people like that, the laissez-faire economics that they promoted, was really just a means by which the British Empire could take down rival nation states through the ability to traffic drugs. Okay, so and even now, right, the global economy finds much of its bread and butter through $700 billion worth of annual drug trade. So in trying to make sense of the global economic scene in relation to the philosophy of economics, I think it's worth pointing out that most people look at these ideologies such as libertarian economics or Keynesian economics or whatever, but they don't generally look at the real on-the-ground, workings of the world, how the world's actually working. And the world is actually working on these black market economies like the drug trade and so forth. So when we think about ideologies of the end times, of immanentism, which is the idea that at any moment there's going to be this returning either savior or a destructive figure, antichrist or whatever, these are actually also ideologies that have been engineered by different power blocks If we look at something like dispensational eschatology, that's an idea that comes out of late 1800s Britain with people like Schofield and J.N. Darby. They were members of, Darby was a member of the Plymouth Brethren, which is a sect of radical, the world's coming to an end at any moment now, and everything centers on what's happening in the Middle East. And interesting enough, Aleister Crowley was actually, as a young man, a member of the Plymouth Brethren sect. So the Plymouth Brethren sect actually gave birth to quite a few subversive ideas that would go on to take on a life of their own. So when we come to now, people like Francis Fukuyama, different philosophers, have posited the idea that intellectually speaking, there's no other options. Liberal democracy, as it's so called, has triumphed. And there's no other way. There's no other way to go. That's the telos, or the end of history, or eschatology, as you mentioned. And really, that works well with these ideologies such as dispensationalism, such as imminent end times, prognostications from Hal Lindsey and these different con men like that, who are consistently wrong about their predictions. But I think this is just a manifestation of human pride and hubris to think that that their philosophy, their ideology is really the catch-all end-all, because really they're just echoing social engineering plans and strategies of different kinds of groups. Because ultimately what that does is it renders you incapable of action. If I believe that within the next week or year the end's coming, might as well give up. There's nothing else to do, right? I mean, we're at the end of history. This is the telos, the purpose of all history is coming to right now. So
yeah, I mean, I always saw the sort of the end of history philosophy as being designed to destroy any kind of cultural or social norms that could resist free market capitalism. So you would see it, for example, in places like Cuba or Iran, or places that actually had some resistance to the idea, of Starbucks coming in, and selling their coffee there, or pornography, or let's say scantily clad women being advertised as models. There was a cultural resistance to that from the various religious point of view or cultural historical point of view. And so the idea behind the free market capitalism was, okay, we have to destroy any philosophy that could basically keep these markets keep these markets out, to keep to basically maintain a cohesion of society, of mores and morals, right? And so that was broken down in America sort of consistently, decade by decade, I would say, going back to the 20s and 30s when Bernays and others were implementing Freudian techniques to sexualize advertising, right? And then step by step, like the women lost a layer of clothing, and the skirts raised higher and higher, and Marilyn Monroe got a poster, and you would see these interviews of men looking at the poster of Marilyn Monroe going like, well, she looked kind of inappropriate, with showing so much of her bust, right? And it's like decade by decade we took away more and more. So really, to me, it wasn't a really question of whether or not it was immoral, but really just how they could utilize the libido to sell things, to sell products, and to basically make this ultimately what now looks almost a completely blank slate of morals. It's like as long as it sells, as long as there's money to be made, that's all that matters in our modern sort of free market conception, even though we know it's not a free market. But the point being the idea of competition in this space. As long as people are buying it, that's what matters, is the concept of monetary, it's almost monetary morality.
yeah, in fact, I'm going to be putting up pictures of my bust on my website. I'm going to test out and see if that has any, if that garners any more traffic, but I don't think it's going to. But probably needs to be a woman. But no, you're absolutely right. That was a joke. You're right that the commodification of everything, including ideologies, translates well into the commodification of every aspect of human living. So like you said, we don't live in a free market, really. We live in a very controlled market that is run, especially from the background, by shadow entities, shadow groups. And when you commodify everything, then what that means is that your whole lifestyle is essentially going to be altered from the way traditional cultures used to operate, to where everything is about quantification. Okay, so there's a interesting writer named Rene Guénon, and he wrote about the reign of quantity, where in this modern era, particularly with the rise of technology, we have an across the board quantification of everything. So everything has to be seen in mathematical algorithms, binary, etc., because it's only useful insofar as it's quantifiable. And the so-called free market scheme that you talk about, which is not really what we're in, fits perfectly with that. And so everything in your life, from your sexuality to your decisions about the future, it's all been altered from traditional cultures that were not that way, that did not view the whole of life in that way. Everything now is about the immediate, the imminent, which fits well with that immanentization of the eschatology that we talked about. Everything is about the here and now, right? So there's no such thing as tradition. There's no such thing as a history or a culture that a people has. There's no such thing as a heritage that you pass on to the future. There's only the immediate satisfaction of, like you said, the libido dominandi, which is the sexual drive. Our baser drives as humans are essentially inverted now to be what dominates us and what rules us. And you're absolutely right to point to Bernays and people like that. This all comes out of Department of Defense, Department of War previously, planning, the CIA working with different advertising agencies, Robert Mullen Company and so forth, to develop ways to engineer American society and ultimately now global society away from traditional ways of living. The RAND Corporation, for example, is an excellent example of this, where RAND put forth the idea that we could transition in the U.S. from an industrial society that created things to, over several decades, to more of a completely consumerist-based society. So yes, the commodification of ideologies fits absolutely perfectly with the immanentization of every sort of desire needing to be fulfilled right now, as well as with the complete removal of all traditional cultures and mores.
But eventually that eschatology has to come to it finds its peak and ultimately comes to its end. It's almost, at a certain point, I think, some philosophers have talked about, after the orgy. It's like, what happens now that you have everything available to you, of every sensual desire, whether it be, appetites of sports games, of pornography, of alcohol, partying, you name it, money. It's all ultimately there in our society. The television channels are constantly, have every show imaginable online. You can watch whatever you want. At some point there's actually a boredom that's going to set in, the ennui at a certain point, saying, well, okay, the end hasn't come, it hasn't arrived. The world hasn't been destroyed. The Avengers have saved the planet yet again. What's the next phase, in the sense of the design, of the management? Where is it going to take us in the next round? Let's say once people have kind of evened out as far as realizing, okay, this party is basically run its course. We have to pay certain debts. I have to deal with, basic needs now, aside from the virtual needs that are being satisfied. Basic needs of, my future prospects and having an actual, job that's going to fulfill me into my 60s and 70s. Those are the kind of, I think, issues that are ultimately going to face, especially the youth generation now, who are basically facing an America that's been depleted economically, that's not investing in its future. As you talked about, the deindustrialization means, guess what? You're going to have more bridges and train derailments and bridges collapsing and issues like that to deal with. So what's the next phase of this?
Well, if we look at the white papers and the planners that lay out their strategies, pretty obliquely, pretty clearly, what they talk about is moving out of all forms of so-called capitalism into the third wave. So if you look in the 1940s, 45 or so, the CFR was already discussing the possibility of merging with the Soviet Union. And there were about 16 or so, the majority of the members of the CFR at that time were all for this idea. So the Cold War, kind of was somewhat of a managed dialectic between the thesis, the United States and capitalism, and the antithesis, the Soviet Union and communism or socialism, whatever. And then the antithesis, the synthesis would be the merging of these two into the third way. So when we look at writers like Alvin Toffler, who talks about the third wave, the third way, He sees it as the transition period where we move into a completely technotronic, a completely technocratic control system where every area of life is monitored by things like artificial intelligence. Every area of life is, like we said before, quantified to where everything is rationed, right? So you only have a certain amount of meat that you can eat each day. You have limits on your carbon output and so forth. And all of these ideas are dreamed up in think tanks like the Club of Rome, the Royal Society, and so forth. So that's the next stage. The next stage is moving away from even the minuscule individual rights that we presently have, property rights, inheritance, things like that. Moving away from that into the global village, the global community, where everything is basically run by smart cities. I mean, that's what the CEO of IBM, Jenny Romedy, gives lectures where she talks about how the smart city is going to come into play. We're going to start with places like Rio, and we're going to have an AI computer, a central grid that runs everything in the city, and they're going to know everything about you, all of your medical history, and they're going to have pre-crime. So that she actually says in her lectures that IBM will install pre-crime software that can predict, future. We've decided that you're going to commit a crime in the future, so we're going to arrest you. No trial, no jury. You've been accused by the bot. The robot has decided. The robot God has decided that you're guilty. So that's the next stage. If there's going to be any actual resistance to that, it's going to have to be millennials and people like that waking up to the fact that the smart city is not going to be the utopia that they sell it as. All that marketing that you talked about is exactly what's going on, where they're trying to basically push everyone into this smart arena, and that's all basically a big trick, a big scam.
Your article about Jade Helm as a psyop could, for example, play into that formulation where a lot of people are talking about Jade Helm obviously as being a precursor to martial law. You're deploying, for me at least, when I saw that the military was doing this domestic sort of, domestic tests with urban warfare. First of all, it occurred to me, well, we've been running urban warfare in cities from across Iraq, in foreign countries for years. So why are we running tests here in America unless you're preparing for this type of battlefield, which is actually with your civilian population? But then if that's the case, why are you telling your people in advance that you're running these operations? If it's really supposed to be a secret operation, wouldn't you just have your military basically in civilian clothing doing certain operations without without scaring people in a sense, but just trying to basically do it discreetly to see how how they interact, as opposed to warning your civilian population? So what is the purpose of Jade Helm as far as your philosophy or your take on it?
Right. Well, if you read about psychological warfare and psyops and what its goal is, the goal of psychological warfare is actually to learn about your opponent or the target audience. Okay, so we shouldn't always immediately accept whatever the narrative is or the story is that's given for the meaning of these events. Okay, so just because there's a tyrannical government and then a so-called patriot group that's opposing them out there in alternative media and whatnot, it does not follow from that's immediately the binary opposition forces that we have to accept. There can actually be meta level or higher level entities, groups that might be tracking or looking at the reaction that would happen from the so-called leaks of these kinds of documents. So in other words, if I, as a military strategist working in psyops, psychological warfare, if I wanted to see what my opponent was going to do in these kinds of situations, all the way back to Machiavelli. Machiavelli discusses this in his classic book, Art of War. Most people are familiar with The Prince, but he also has another book, Art of War, where he discusses different tactics like this. So this is an old strategy. He says you can actually leak fake information, to provoke the opponent so that you can learn what kind of reaction they will do in these scenarios. Fast forward to now, what a situation like Jade Helm could do is, pick out the states that might be majority so-called Tea Party Republican, like Texas, put it out there as if this is this so-called, martial law drill, gun confiscation, roundup, whatever, and then watch and see from the vantage point of social network algorithm tracking, Google searching and so forth. watch and see how this takes on a life of its own. And what you do is then all that data is recorded so that after several instances of these kinds of things, you have, from a game theory perspective or from a rational choice theory that the entities like Rand have dealt with historically with people like Herman Kahn, the doomsday machine, and so forth. You can then gauge with predictive percentage, assurance, 95, 98, 99% assurance as to what the group will do in an actual scenario like that. So it's more so about wargaming and more so about learning the trends of mass movements from a tech perspective than it is anything to do with imminent martial law.
But it could be a precursor to more and more of the technological control that you're talking about,
Absolutely.
the technocratic control of our society. And I think that's really where it gets interesting, the fact of information control, how you take, for example, what's happened in Baltimore recently, where a riot was provoked around this one character, Freddie Gray, who was presumably killed by the police, and yet how many people before him were killed and abused by police officers? Why is it this one event becomes the trigger point for this uprising? That always makes it curious to me as far as how much this is perhaps being controlled as a created opposition, or as a, not because it's not genuine, not because it's not genuine people that are disenfranchised and disgruntled, but again, how much of the what we saw, for example, in the past with the Orange Revolution, the Velvet Revolutions, people said there's a lot of Twitter and flash mobs were being sort of organized and spurred on, and all it takes is a bit of organization to basically get that mob riled up and ready to protest, and then all it takes a little bit to escalate from a protest into a little bit of violence and rioting. So again, we see perhaps this potential for the dialectic coming home, basically into America, whether it's based on race, social inequality and justice, but basically being a precursor to more and more top-down autocratic federalization of the police force and totalitarian control of our country.
Yeah, I have an article, ISIS, Feminists, and Thugs, and it talks about the think tank and foundation funding and utilizing of these different so-called revolutionary movements. So as we talked about at the beginning with the ideology of the French Revolution, the Jacobins, the radical revolutionaries, it's the same principle at work here, where think tanks and foundations, Open Society, Carnegie, roundtable groups, Rand, etc., these groups will actually draw up plans for how to target certain social niches, certain markets of people. And then what you do is, through psychological warfare, you target that group for their specific grievances, sometimes legitimate feelings of oppression and so forth. And you can market to them a complete packaged ideology. And what that does then is, so you see ISIS, you see radical Islam, you see feminist groups, radical feminism, radical gender issues. You see disenfranchised areas like you're talking about, like in Ferguson or Baltimore. These groups are targeted with a specific ideology. Agents of change then agent provocateurs then provoke that with the aid of media to become a big spectacle. And what this does is that it sends out then into the mass conscious, to the news viewing public, the idea that all of this chaos is going on. There's riots everywhere. So it basically creates pandemonium. And so, like you said, it's you can look at Jade Helm as the system's right-hand response to the system's left-hand provocations through events like Baltimore. So you have to always manage this left and right like that. So absolutely.
Well, now talking about the management and talking about a system, and obviously we're talking about organizations and groups that date themselves back to the Illuminati, back to historically to those basically financiers of empires going back perhaps thousands of years. Where do you trace the lineage of the shadow rulers? How high have you gotten in your research and analysis of this mysterious Illuminati?
In my view, I would trace it more so ideologically. I mean, certainly there are families. We think about Venetian banking, black nobility, that we can go back to. I mentioned Machiavelli before. If we look at Florence, the Medicis, and so forth, their strategies of banking, their strategies of false flags, even though Machiavelli doesn't use the term false flag, in Art of War, he's actually describing false flags. This is, hundreds of years ago. So if we look at that ideology, that strategy for control, for taking over, that's essentially the same pattern that we see that moves into the British Empire. So there are spies like Paolo Sarpi. He was a Venetian spy who was also working with the British at the time of the Renaissance. So Renaissance espionage, Renaissance spying, this goes way back. John Dee wasn't the first 007 in the sense of the tricks and tactics. He was literally the first 007, but the techniques of spying go back way, far earlier than that. So I would trace it ultimately to Venetian banking, the structure of banking that we have now. And it, like you said, it probably goes back much earlier in terms of ancient techniques of, creating some form of currency that actually stands in for the gold, where there's, swiping of gold, bait and switch going on in the background. That's an old strategy, but the banking empire itself, as it runs today, I think finds its origin in Venice. So then when we fast forward up to the British Empire, into the European banking houses, that is essentially who's still running the show, just behind the scenes, and they control the drug trade too. So that's the banking, the drugs, insurance fraud, all these different massive empires of fraud are essentially run by all the same groups of people.
Because there's a common vested economic interest. But what would you say is the ideological mentality that underlies their empire?
Probably goes back, earlier than anything in Freemasonry. Freemasonry is more of at least the London version of it's more of a recent phenomenon. But you can go back to Gnosticism in the early Christian era. The Gnostics had the idea that theosis or apotheosis, that man could achieve divinity, could be achieved through knowledge. And so I think ultimately the ideology of scientism, technocracy, what we see in later Jacobins or Illuminists like Saint Simon, these are thinkers who set us on the path towards the belief that through transhumanism, through technology, through man's work, that nature can be perfected. So nature itself is somehow inherently flawed, it's wrong, and it's broken, and it needs the perfection of the work of alchemy. So ultimately the alchemical idea that base matter can be transmuted into immortal matter or gold, that's sort of what the allegory stands for, is done through the work of technology, techne in the Greek. So that's an ancient idea, and the fulfillment of it is ultimately, I would say, through transhumanism and some sort of Luciferian idea of transcending bodily limitation, the old Gnostic idea, through techne.
But at what point, at what point does that become a corrupting idea? For example, because the idea of technology as an extension of man's power over the earth, has obviously led to our higher state of existence, a higher living standard, right? Most of the industrial advancements that we've seen across the planet, that's obviously an extension of man's, implementation of technology over nature, and ideally in conjunction with natural and with understanding of how nature actually functions, which is really what alchemy is supposed to be about, right?
Right.
It's supposed to understand nature in order to then, basically sometimes hurry the process or help the process along. But at what point does that become a corrupting, destructive, satanic aspect? How does it become inverted and warped into a satanic philosophy? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, there's a lot of thinkers that you could look at to where it possibly becomes inverted. I mean, all the way back to, the Garden of Eden, what Lucifer offered was godhood, supposedly, under the auspices of that God was trying to keep you away from godhood so that he could have it all to himself. But if you do what I say, eat of the tree, you'll attain godhood. So that ideology of human hubris is ancient. Whatever view you have of Genesis, that the principle there, the truth there is the same. But where it becomes corrupted, I would say, is that men have always, they have a corrupt side. All of us have a corrupt side within us. So we've always had that potential for corruption. But I think when we look at people like, say, Crowley talked about storming heaven, overthrowing God, and for him, this is probably more of an ideological, revolutionary principle. I don't know that he really believed that you were literally, going into heaven and overthrowing God, but he talked about setting forth complete chaos magic, etc., to bring about a new order of things. So there's really, I don't think, any specific point where you can say within history, well, here's the guy where this is where it begins, because it's more of a an evolving philosophy or ideology of man's preeminence, all the way back to the story of Prometheus.
Right. Well, exactly. I mean, I would say Prometheus is actually a similar story to Lucifer in the garden, except that Prometheus is actually a heroic figure because he's defying Zeus, who's more of an oligarchical god, right? And he's a representation of the aristocracy, the oligarchy, the ones who want to prevent man from having technology. And so it's a very different interpretation, obviously, of the serpent, who's offering knowledge. The real question, I guess, being once again, like, at what point does it become degrading? At what point do we think philosophically that you're going too far in playing God? At what point is the notion of genetics, genetic modification, or understanding of how the genome works, and trying. I think this is always the issue that basically confronts us as humans. Is at what point does it become evil to actually tamper with the genetic system if you're trying to basically make prevent children from being born with certain diseases, right, or being born handicapped. If you could prevent that eugenically, right, isn't that a positive thing? But or at what point does it become a negative? Because, for example, you're tampering with things that you don't understand necessarily the consequence in the long term of what it will create for the next generation, or how it will permanently harm that child's genetics and DNA, going forth into their future.
Right. I don't think there's a clear answer, and I think that's the difficulty. There's no laid out, guideline of exactly what point crosses the line. But what I do know is that for the majority of the people who are involved in the advancing of all these different genetic engineering, bioengineering, biometrics, et cetera, their stated ideology is anti-human. So even though there may not be clear answers as to what constitutes crossing the line, we know for sure that the people who are behind this, they're all about crossing the line. They're the same people that were involved in the Manhattan Project, which was testing radiological effects on human beings, human troops, in all manner of really nefarious practices. So there's just unfortunately there's not a clear answer, but it's not the technology in itself is bad. I mean, certainly it can take us it can be a positive thing, but I think when you're crossing different breeds, injecting DNA from one animal into another animal, I think you're really getting into dangerous territory here, because that's even, if I have a robotic arm or something, that's one thing. But when you're actually messing with my DNA, which is what they're actually doing, that's a whole nother level, because as far as we know, I don't know. I mean, there may be gene replacement therapy that works or something, but I mean, that's more damaging, and it actually damages the whole biosphere. So you can damage and attack the whole biosphere with this kind of meddling. So, I don't know that there is a clear answer as to what crosses the line.
There is a theory, because I know you've done analysis on films like David Lynch's Twin Peaks, which kind of delves into a bit of the demonic aspect of the people behind, let's say, the beings behind the curtain, right, who are part of the astral planes and the various realms, the non-physical realms. There is obviously a theory that the ultimate philosophy of the dark side of this, the dark side of alchemy or the Illuminati, deriving from the fallen angels, going back to Genesis, as you mentioned, who basically fell from the heavens, who basically are not allied with the God's creation being mankind and this planet, nature. Their alignment is with the inversion of everything. Let's say the tampering and destruction of that natural habitat and God's created beings. So there is perhaps, I'm sure you've encountered this, the philosophy that many of these tamperings and transformations that they're trying to achieve actually is almost the destruction or the recreation of God's world.
Yes. No, absolutely. I think you're spot on there. We look back to figures like John Dee. John Dee has works where he supposedly channeled a complete, alphabet, Enochian magic alphabet that was angelic language, angelic script, and so we can find this pattern throughout history of sort of a higher level of linguistics or semiotics, where the symbology is not just for the transmission of knowledge between humans, but that there's actually a higher level script of possible symbology, linguistics, where you're speaking an angelic language. So that actually ties into things like synchronicity, synchromysticism, especially if you look at ancient Eastern traditions, Vedic views of synchronicity, where it's actually, it doesn't matter whether it's something that you're reading, say say you're reading about Patrick Swayze, and then She's Like the Wind comes on the radio.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, so I mean that you have two different forms of communication: the song and the script, and so in other words, both of these events are actually a script. They're both tying together in a sort of string of a sentence, if you will, which is basically what semiotics or symbology talks about. So in the same way, the idea that there are higher levels, meta levels of writing things or scripting things applies not just to events and synchronicity, but also to linguistics. So you can have some sort of form or symbol, a sigil or something like that, that applies not just to the name of an angel, but it also relates to, say, some planetary sphere, so forth. So for the ancient medieval mind, there's different levels, spheres that pertain to the planets. So when the soul dies, it passes through these different spheres. So relating this to Twin Peaks, I thought it was fascinating that a lot of people have found Lynch's stuff very mysterious, hard to decode. But I think when you have a good grounding in esoteric stuff, occult type stuff, you can really decode it pretty well. So he says, I learned that just beyond this realm, there's another realm where he talks about deriving a lot of his ideas from. So a lot of the dream world, the astral realm, this stuff plays into Lynch's works, and that's what we see in Twin Peaks. So the lodge is actually taking place in the astral realm; it's in the spiritual realm, but it has its analogs on Earth, right? So events that are happening on Earth are actually paralleling events that are happening in the Black Lodge, as it's called, in the astral realm. So what's going on is essentially that there's a sacrifice that takes place with a group of occultists that have been actually raping Laura Palmer, the blonde sacrifice, who is multiple personality. She has MPD, DID, from traumatic experiences that she had with her dad. So there's pedophilia, there's incest. This resulted in her being bipolar and disassociative. And so she's actually sacrificed to the cult. And what happens is the spirit that possesses her dad at the point of the sacrifice brings the blood to the so-called man from another place, who is representative of these otherworldly entities or demons, spirits, etc., jinn, whatever you want to call them. And the killing spirit drops the blood down, and he offers it as a sacrifice as food, right? And he actually explicitly calls it pain and misery. So the pain and misery of the sacrificial victim that's contained in the blood is what the spiritual entity or demon feeds upon, and that's actually all revealed in the show. So I thought that was a really profound, degree level of esoteric understanding that was, flew over most people's head in terms of Twin Peaks.
Yeah, and it would behoove people to actually understand that how real that is, and that is the esoteric understanding of reality. That we are basically in, as the Hermeticists would call it, it's basically a reality of reflections. That this domain is not the end all be all. It's actually, this is mirrored in various other astral planes, and oftentimes what we're seeing in the physical realm is only a representation of that which exists in the astral, or in the immaterial.
Absolutely. And modern physics is even talking now about the revival of the notion of ether. All right. So when we look at people like Tesla said his ideas, his great inventions were based on the principle of ether. The ether is the ancient idea of a fifth element. All right. So you have, the classic four elements, and then there's also this subtle, energetic, or somewhat perhaps electrical substrate fabric that underlies everything. That's ether.
So again, just going back to do you have any optimism as far as the potential transformation that humans can do as far as their own consciousness in sort of throwing off these managers, these controllers who obviously are constantly planning and creating these left-right dialectical events for us to believe in, these the TV shows and the sort of the games that are constantly distracting us and keeping us fed, our lower appetites fed, meanwhile our higher awareness is being,
right,
let's say, stifled in this matrix. Do you have any hope for the sort of the spiritual awakening or the revolution in consciousness?
I think it's possible. Human potential is amazing, or else they wouldn't expend so much energy, effort, money, and manpower to control it. And I think that alone demonstrates that there is potential for things to change. I mean, it's not like there's any inherent necessity or determinism behind having to believe that everything gets worse and worse and worse. And so, like you pointed out with that imminentist eschatology, that everything's just coming to a drastic doom and end, that itself is an ideology of defeat. It's sold as something to wear us down, to get us depressed, to think that we can't change anything, we can't do anything, there's no point, just give up. And it's not true, right? So that in itself, the very fact that they have to expend so much time and energy on psyops, on social engineering, on control, on lies and deception, is what proves that it's not absolutely determined and necessary. So yeah, absolutely. I think the best place to start, as a philosopher, I always recommend people to start questioning your assumptions and your presuppositions. Just because you're raised in something doesn't mean that it's true. You could be raised in something false, right? So recovering the belief that there is objective truth is one place to start, and learning things like basic logic, basic reasoning, basic critical thinking skills, which most people unfortunately don't have. So if you start with, say, the top logical fallacies, the common fallacies, informal fallacies that people use, once you learn 15 or 20 of them, you'll start noticing that, hey, that news guy was actually using a fallacy. What he said didn't follow from the premises. The conclusion was a non sequitur from the premises. So those are good places to start as a philosophy guy.
Mm-hmm. So, and also you can check out jaysanalysis.com.
Yeah, you can. Like I said, jaysanalysis.com. I also have a section where you can subscribe, and I offer in-depth, pretty advanced, not always, but somewhat advanced philosophical discussions, interviews with media, historians, philosophers, people, comparative religion, etc., as well as offering philosophy lectures. So if you want to avoid the state school system, or any sort of Marxist or tainted ideologies, you can actually go through some of my lectures that are very cheaply priced, and get a better grounding than you would at the local state university.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Jay. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and
Thanks,
hopefully we'll have more time to discuss in future.